So, do you think there's an opposition between machine and human beings?
I'm sorry, what the question is what?
An opposition between the machine and the human being?
No. I mean, if you want a simple answer, no.
And if I want a more complete answer, what should you say? Because your work is about that, no?
Yeah. So, I mean, we've had technology for a long, long, long time. I mean, the first, stick in a way is a kind of technology. So, I don't know where at what point you want to call it a machine. I would say what we're dealing with today when we talk about technology is a kind of quantum jump. And part of that jump is that it is now really integrating with our bodies, with the human body. And so today I would say it's continuous.
This is now, but you began speaking about that before.
Yes.
Before artificial intelligence and all that, right?
So I think philosophically the machine and the body or the human is connection. I mean, the machine is created by the humans. So it's an organic extension of the human species. So conceptually, no, they're connected. They're different qualitatively, but they're connected. Yeah.
But why are you obsessed by this subject?
To go back to what I was just saying, I think that the integration of, if you want to say machines or technology, is undergoing a transformation now that is unprecedented, and it's of a qualitative shift, a quantum change that is worth examining, is worth looking at, is worth slowing down and really assessing what this change is. It's very new and very strange, and I think it's something that I, in my lifetime, found could keep me going. I mean, that it whetted my curiosity to be able to devote my life to trying to explore it in my work.
Since when?
Well, I mean, I started working actively as an artist probably in 1980, in that period. But even before, I mean, I weighed being an architect when I was a student.
And in a prestigious university, MIT, no?
It was at MIT, and even then I felt whether I was going to be designing buildings or doing art, or whether it would be somehow, I wanted to address this change going on in that this sort of technological interface was going to transform things. So that was always there in a way. In some ways I chose to go to MIT for that very reason, because I felt that I wanted to immerse myself in a very technological environment to just get a feeling for it. It wasn't about becoming a computer programmer, which I'm not. I can't program.
Yes.
But really to get a sense of the affect, if you will, this sort of emotional, psychological dimension of technology, or what technology might become.
And why did you abandon architecture?
I think it's an issue of, after a long struggle for the decision, it wasn't an obvious decision for me. I didn't think I had the temperament to be an artist. It was something I felt that I didn't really have a choice. And I actually tried, I got my professional degree, I was in an office, and I began to, at times, just wondering, well, what if I just walked out and just never came back? And then I knew there was a big problem. Yeah.
And your parents were very unhappy.
They knew I was wrestling with a decision. I think by then I was old enough, so they felt that I knew the consequences if I made that decision, and they were, they were supportive.
Nice.
I mean, my father still introduced me as an architect, 10 years later. So he hadn't really made the shift, but once I could show, how I was going to support myself and whatever, then they were fine. Yeah.
So after that, you tried to find a way of expressing your obsession, right? About the machine, about the technology. So how did it work? Because you are creating something very unique, right?
I'm sorry, what's the question though?
So how did it work to create a complete new universe? How did you begin with that? Did you begin
Well, I
with
didn't
that?
begin with the idea I'm going to create a big new universe. It happened. I can only talk now in the way I am in retrospect.
Okay.
The way it felt was very, very incremental, just step by step. It was very intuitive. So I didn't really know where I was going with it. But I just had an intuitive sense of something that was interesting to look at, to explore. And that was this interface. And I began with just looking or examining in my own life what are the properties of what I'm experiencing here and now. And I happened to have a job. I didn't calculate this. It just happened to be that word processing offered well-paying freelance jobs that enabled me to, work in the studio and then go in and do the job. And
Yeah.
So it just turned out that job was working with a screen. And it was the beginning of this interactive interface with technology, in contrast to television or radio or telephone. So that was the understanding of technology at that point in the culture. I never imagined a desktop computer, or the iPhone, the iPad, or any of these things that we have today. So it was just this already emerging interface. We've talked about how much time people were spending watching television. So here I was in the office and I was looking at the screen, but it was more interactive. It was only with words at that point. We called it a word processor, but you could put in certain variables and then they could think for you. So you could put the sentence and it would finish it for you. So there was this kind of interactive quality to it.
It was the ancestor of artificial intelligence in a way?
In a way, yeah. The computer was already beginning to finish your sentence. This is within, editing documents. So lawyers were using it. I was working in a law firm.
Okay.
I was working in a Wall Street law firm. So it was very intensive
And
word processing.
how to translate that on a canvas?
Well, that's taken me a life. I mean, that translation and how to visualize it is what, for me, was an interesting challenge. But I had no idea how I would be able to do it. And so I started with just the properties of what I was experiencing. So in the beginning, it was just the sense of illusion that the screen offered. At the same time, I was very aware of my body in front of this box and the screen. So I felt there was this paradoxical paradigm of being in a very real kind of context of physical material, and then this very illusionistic world. And coming from art, and at that time it was minimalist, post-minimalist work that I was very involved with, there was a similar kind of ontology or dimension that work was dealing with, which was to be very, very concrete. So if you look at the work, certainly the minimalism, it's just to take the material that's here and now and put it in the same space that we are. And there was a kind of anti-illusion to that whole effort. So I thought that was interesting in contrast to what I was actually experiencing working with the screen, which was actually very much an illusion. I said, how is that, if this continues to grow, how can that re-enter the creative space of visual art?
But you kept on with canvas.
I kept on with canvas.
Yeah.
I didn't really, maybe because I was coming from architecture, I started more with sculpture.
Okay.
But that was too concrete. I think you're right. And so my early training was with painting. So I had probably in terms of just pure quote unquote academic training was really with painting. So I was very aware of the history of Western painting. And in looking back at that, I was very aware that there was this interesting evolution from, let's say, the flatness of Giotto, and that effort to create illusion that was not given; it had to be invented. And I felt that that was very inspiring once I understood art history more deeply. That effort to actually create the third dimension visually on a two-dimensional
In 2D,
plane.
yeah. That's the story.
That is
Create,
just, and I don't think
the
people...
impossible.
Yes, and so that made me realize the contingency of that just happened, made me aware, well, then it may not be that this will be the only option we will have, and that perhaps there is some other option we could have in which illusion will re-enter somehow. And so that was the question. How could illusion re-enter if in fact the world is going to become more about illusion? So the question is how to do that.
So it was creating illusion about illusion?
Well, this gets very metaphysical. I mean, it's more the paradox that the world is very, I mean, I look at it, even with this, I always see a metaphor in terms of art. So the metaphor of pop art, or even minimalism, even though they seem very different, it's really the here and now. It's no longer, so if you look, let's say, at earlier art where, let's say, you have sort of philosophical systems or religion. So, for instance, the idea that you could only express the world through religious symbolism, that was remarkable to me. They would never imagine in that period to do a painting about an apple. Or, I mean, if you want to look at, Asian ink painting, they could only do landscapes. And, there's a very
rules.
Sort of very academic, but very bounded idea of what imaging you could actually do as a painter. So, for me, there was this very referencing a very concrete world that we live in. The whole modernist enterprise was to get very concrete, that we're just molecules and sort of the physics of our reality versus the I don't want to say illusionistic, but more symbolic world of religion.
Of what?
Of religion. A religious figure.
So, but you spoke about a paradox. What is a paradox?
The what?
Paradox. You
the paradox. Yes.
You don't understand my very good French accent.
It may be more the ambient noise right now. So it's no comment on your French accent.
Thank you to be polite.
So the paradox is that I couldn't say, okay, let's just do an illusionary image. It needs to be both something very literal and illusionistic at the same time. How could that happen? So I did not want to do a square painting, because that's the metaphor there is you're looking through a crop, a window, into another world. And so that to me is an illusion. So the illusion of three dimensions. Or you can go, let's say, into modernist painting where it's literally the paint on the canvas. It gets more abstract. It's very literal. So where could I introduce a kind of illusion? So the early works were really trying to create an illusion of a flatness that refers to the objectness. And that was the conceptual underpinning of how that early work emerged in the early 80s.
And after that?
Somehow, the work, I somehow reached a point where it came out. I was able to achieve a certain sense of illusion, and then it was still an object. I was not thinking about the iPhone or the iPad. So the rounded corners was not about social media devices. It was just about this sense of the object. The rounded corners literally made it an object. It was no longer a square window you look into, being that windows are generally square, windows with glass. So then with that was in a way I call it now in retrospect, talking about it, is a syntax. I wanted to change the syntax of how I was going to depict the world in a quote-unquote two-dimensional framework. And so I had that syntax there. It has a sense of illusion, and it was an object. And then the question is, how can I begin to talk about the world? And within that syntax, that flatness that begins to sort of wave and undulate I somehow arrived, and this was happening in a process of several years. This isn't something I just had this idea.
For sure.
So you have if you look at the landscape, and in painting you have landscapes, you have figurative painting. There are only several different kind of formats that people have here. So the landscape, which is a flatness from sort of topology, that it begins to undulate. And then you look at the body, it has the same kind of topography. It's a flatness, kind of a surface skin. And then when I was looking at the television, when the television image blanks out, you have this flatness that sort of waves. So I thought by having that as the visual equivalent in the work, I would be able to reference landscape, body, and technology all at the same time. And that's what I was looking for. So that I would, as the work would evolve, I would be able to address the conditions of the world, of the landscape, the body, and technology with this syntax that was developing. That was basic format.
And technically, today you have a very special kind of painting, if we can say so. Could you explain that?
Well, I guess when you use this, I don't know whether it's special or not, but it's an evolution of that early work in a way. And what really has happened, and people say, well, why didn't you show? Why did you withdraw? Why have we not seen your work in more recent years? And it was more that, in retrospect, in some ways, the technology has evolved such that it is enabling that initial concept that I've been talking about to unfold in a way that was convincing. And one of the comments in the early work when I first started showing was, if you're talking about technology, why aren't you working technologically?
Yes.
And that was a very valid comment.
But who cares?
So
you were isolated?
But
isolated.
You're looking at the work, it feels very old world. It was all made by hand, and it felt a little clumsy.
For me, that's the real paradox of your work.
That's it. So, so that's why I moved to silkscreen, because then it was at least a little more technological. But I was able to, if you look at that silkscreen work, I'm still doing images by hand, but then photographing and then translating it into a printing medium, which is the beginning of a sort of technological medium. And that allowed then for me to access the media images.
But you also had silicone, no?
Well, that came later. So
silicone is very contemporary.
Now it is. I just accidentally discovered that for my work because it was used in sculpture. It basically was used in mold making because it was non-toxic. Earlier it was used urethane, which you had to wear a mask. It was very toxic. I won't use toxic materials in the studio. So when I was doing these sculptures, which actually wasn't interactive, using computers and sensors, I said, gee, it's too bad I'm not doing painting because this medium is so painterly. And then a few years later, I actually had the time and focus to experiment with using silicone. But that development of the silicone took a number of years because silicone has very tricky properties. One is it won't bond to anything.
And you do it on your own, or you have some assistant?
No, in most of the years I was just on my own. Yeah.
And when did you begin with silicone?
The silicone work probably started in around 2010, 2008, around there.
And when you begin speaking or trying to speak about technology, you were very isolated, very lonely, no?
I wouldn't say I was lonely, but I didn't have many contemporaries that I felt were asking similar questions.
Could you share your preoccupation with some other artists? Were you part of a group?
Where what?
Were you part of a group?
There just weren't very many people that were, So I guess what it was that there was, I listened to music all the time, and in literature, people were beginning to ask these questions. Some of it was more in the science fiction realm, and I really was not interested in science fiction. I wasn't trying to create some really strange new world. I wanted something very much about what's right now, and people couldn't get that. They said, this is not about right now. This is something you're fantasizing here. So that gap was just very frustrating. It wasn't worth it for me to try to convince them that I was trying to address something that actually I saw was happening. And I wasn't interested in the fantasy world. And I wasn't trying to create that kind of world. So when people often immediately say, Crash or Eraserhead, those films, and I understood what they were seeing, but that's not where I was going, or that's not the world I was trying to elicit here. So in some ways, perhaps I'm too, I had a very, I don't want to say rational, but there was a very rigorously conceptual underpinning to what I wanted to do.
But you were not suffering of isolation? When you were in New York already?
I was in New York.
Who were your friends, artists?
Well, a lot of my friends were not artists, so that's it. I had a full life that was not connected to the art world.
Okay.
And I think that was very important, and it didn't bother me. I never found, I started by chance with a gallery that was very much, in the art world, and I met people, but success in the art world was not going to sustain me, and I knew that very quickly. So I was not looking for that kind of support.
But now it is.
It is, and it's nice, but it's not what's keeping me going or keeping the work going. It's not what motivates me at all.
So what motivates you now?
Well, the same thing. It's just this question and how to express it. And I now, of course, I have. I said from the beginning, the work will reveal itself, and that I couldn't explain it or show it necessarily at that time, the whole thing. I had it in my head, the strategy I was using or the steps I needed to take. In a way, the model was more of a kind of, laboratory, a kind of research level. Now, in a way, so the work has different projects going on, and I'm a little impatient in my work, so I may do a work too, and then I want to go to the next thing. I can see the next step. So to do, let's say, 10 pieces around one idea that I already see the problems. I'm a much more tougher critic on myself than a lot of the critics would be. So the frustrating me, I'm not going to use 10 more of these. I know there are problems here, so I want to go to the next thing. So then I end up with a lot of just eccentric pieces that people say, well, I don't understand what this is about at all. So now the work has evolved where I've begun to understand it, and ironically, actually, when much more recently with the Sculpture Center show, where I could suddenly see all the work together because most of it had been in storage, it really revealed itself in a way that I hadn't seen even in my studio.
That's interesting, right?
Yes, and so I suddenly understood it wasn't about any one work, it was really about all of the work and all the different sort of tangents that I took in the work. And then there was something else that was coming out, and that is how I could begin to say, when they say, what is your work about? I would say, well, it's a kind of an embodied technology. But that's not something I had in my mind at all during the whole
But
process.
there's a kind of anxiety in it, no?
Yes.
In your work.
Yes. Are you asking, is there or there was?
I'm asking, but I'm observing too.
I mean, I can identify, there was anxiety in all this effort over the years. I don't know whether the anxiety is expressed now in the work.
Yeah,
but
I think
it very
so.
could be. I can't, I don't have.
Sorry.
I mean, that's not something I can necessarily see. The work says something a lot that I don't see. I mean, that's the idea that the artist may not really understand what the work is doing.
But it looks like your human being are in the jail of technology.
Okay, I'll accept that. I was not thinking. I feel like I'm imprisoned in technology when I was doing the work. It's really a much more sort of, just this body technological feeling. It's really a feeling I want. That it looks like that now, I think is interesting, because I say, well, actually, when I think about it, maybe we are really being imprisoned by our technology.
Yes.
And so maybe the work is telling me something that's exactly what I want to do. I want to say, so what really is going on here? And maybe that's what it's telling us. I don't know. That's not something I think
But
I really
you have
can
a
say.
smartwatch? I can't believe it.
I do feel, actually, if you want to talk about it in my life, technology is controlling my life in a way that is way too much. I use my alarm system now just to remind me what to do next. So my life is governed by these little bells.
Yes.
And then, I'm a little bit of a news junkie, and then you have your emails, and we're all doing that now. And I'm aware that in a way our lives are becoming more like the technology, but it's so seductive and so seamless. We're not aware necessarily of, in a way, the violence of it. It's actually quite violent, what it's doing.
Very much.
And I think there's a lot of anxiety people feel, but they don't really know how to get out of it. So in a way, maybe that is the nature of the quote-unquote prison that you're referring to.
Yes.
It's not bars like a jail.
And so what is the next step now in your work?
There are a number of different projects right now that I'm exploring. I think I want to go further still with an intuitive sense that's still there. It needs to unfold more. It needs to reveal itself more. And I'm just trying to provide the creative time and space to allow that to happen, in contrast to now kind of the more commercialized art world that I've come to understand that is the reality of the art world today, whether we want it or not.
Yeah, but you need to protect you from it, no?
That protection is somewhat of a battle, but I am aware that I don't feel it's realistic to be super idealistic here, to do a kind of Cézanne kind of going on, because in a way, having more resources now is actually enabling the work to unfold in ways I never could have done before.
Yes, for sure.
So it's a two-edged dilemma here. So it's not black or white, and it's not a simple decision how to go.
Bon, merci monsieur.